The fireplace in the Falcone mansion crackled with orange flames, but it couldn't warm the ice that had settled deep inside Isabella Hartwell's chest. She sat on the velvet armchair in a charcoal wool dress, her slender fingers trembling as they gripped a silk handkerchief already soaked through with tears she'd cried earlier that afternoon. Across from her, separated by a walnut table and 4 years of silence disguised as marriage, sat Luciano Falcone, dawn of the most feared mafia dynasty in Manhattan, a man whose ice-blue eyes had made grown men beg for mercy, now staring at the divorce papers like they were his own death sentence. At 36, Luciano was carved from everything dangerous. His custom Brioni suit fit his towering frame like armor, the Falcone falcon ring on his finger catching the firelight, the ink of his family crest peeking above the collar of his white shirt. He'd built an empire with those hands. He'd buried enemies with those hands. But tonight, those same hands couldn't save the one thing he'd ever truly loved. Isabella was 27, once a piano teacher at Juilliard with dreams as soft as her amber brown eyes. Now a woman broken by a diagnosis that had ruled her womb empty for 2 years straight. And the Falcone bloodline demanded an heir. His aunt had made that clear. The Capos had made that clear. Even the silence at the dinner table had made that clear. So tonight, Isabella had made her choice. She wouldn't let him drown beside her anymore. She'd sign her name. She'd set him free. She'd let him find a woman who could give him the sons his empire required. What neither of them knew, as she picked up that Mont Blanc pen with a shaking hand, was that a miracle was already growing inside her. And standing quietly by the doorway, an old housekeeper with silver hair and the same ice-blue eyes as the Don himself watched the scene unfold, clutching a secret she'd carried for 32 years. A secret that was about to shatter everything the Falcone family thought they knew about love, betrayal, and blood. If you're enjoying this story so far, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good romance, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Your support means the world to us. Now let's get back to the story. 4 years ago, on a cold autumn afternoon in Queens, Isabella Hartwell's life was torn in two by a phone call. Her father, Thomas Hartwell, the man who had always stood firm like a slab of granite against every storm life threw at him, called her for the first time with a voice trembling like a child's. Hartwell Construction, the construction company he had built over 30 years, had just declared bankruptcy. A high-rise project on Long Island had collapsed, dragging the entire family fortune down with it. And worse than all of that, he had borrowed $2 million from someone who wasn't a bank, wasn't a friend, but a name that made all of Manhattan whisper behind closed doors. Falcone. Isabella abandoned her piano lesson at Juilliard that afternoon and drove across the Queensboro Bridge in her thin wool coat, only to reach her childhood home and find her father sitting with his head bowed over the kitchen table, a black envelope placed in front of him. Inside the envelope was a card embossed with gold lettering, inviting him to the Falcone mansion to discuss a repayment arrangement. Mrs. Hartwell had cried. Isabella's 16-year-old brother had hidden in his room, and she, a 23-year-old woman who had just earned her master's degree in music, stepped through that doorway in her father's place the next morning. Luciano Falcone received her in his second-floor study, where sunlight poured through the tall windows and formed golden strips across the oak floor. He was 32 years old then, had been sitting in the Don's chair for 14 years, and his voice was deep, like an engine rumbling beneath the earth. His offer was very simple. The $2 million debt would be erased. Her father would have his honor restored. Her brother would be able to go to college. In exchange, Isabella would become his wife, officially carry the Falcone name, and live in his mansion on the Upper East Side. He didn't explain why he had chosen her. He didn't promise love. He only placed a contract on the desk and waited. Isabella signed it. Her hand didn't tremble, but her heart died a little in that moment. The wedding took place 3 weeks later at a small church by the Hudson River, with only both families and a few trusted capos of the family present. She wore the white lace gown her mother had chosen through tears, and when Luciano slid the ring onto her finger, she thought she had just stepped into a golden prison. But the strangest thing in Isabella's life wasn't that forced marriage. The strangest thing was what happened afterward. On her first night at the Falcone mansion, Luciano led her to a room in the East Wing, opened the door, and let her stand frozen before a glossy black Steinway piano placed in the middle of a room flooded with moonlight. He had known she taught piano. He had known she had once dreamed of becoming a concert pianist before her father's bankruptcy forced her to teach in order to help support her family. In his steady, low voice, He told her that this room belonged to her alone, that he would never disturb her when she played, and that he had someone ship the piano from a concert hall in Vienna in only 10 days. That night, he slept in another room. And that night, Isabella cried until sleep took her, unable to understand why the man the whole world called a monster treated her as though she were the most precious thing he had ever touched. In the months that followed, Luciano remained a busy shadow. He left the house before sunrise and came home when she was already asleep. But every Sunday morning, he sat with her in the dining room, drank black coffee, and listened as she talked about the sonatas she was practicing. He never smiled, but his ice blue eyes sometimes warmed slightly when she spoke of Chopin. He gave her books, rare sheet music bought at auctions in London. He remembered that she liked white peonies. He remembered that she couldn't drink red wine. He remembered everything about her, while she kept believing he never truly looked. By the 13th month after the wedding, on a spring night, when she was playing Chopin's Nocturne No. 2 in the music room, Isabella looked up and saw Luciano standing in the doorway, still in his work suit, a glass of whiskey in his hand, silently listening to her. The look in his eyes, then, was no longer the look of a dawn. It was the look of a man watching the only thing that still made him believe this world wasn't entirely dark. Isabella stopped playing, and in the moment when the two of them looked at each other across the candlelit room, she suddenly recognized a truth that had been quietly growing inside her heart for 2 years, a truth she hadn't dared to name. She had fallen in love with him. She had fallen in love with the man she was supposed to hate, loved him with a love as deep as the ocean and as terrifying as hell, loved him so much that she knew if he ever abandoned her one day, she wouldn't have enough strength left to stand again. But love, Isabella would soon learn, wasn't strong enough to stand against Falcone blood. At the beginning of the 3rd year of their marriage, when she had just turned 26, the pains in her lower abdomen began to appear every night. At first, she thought it was only stress. Then she thought it was a menstrual disorder. Then came the mornings when she woke to such dizziness that she had to grip the edge of the bed to steady herself. She hid it from Luciano for nearly 3 months, until one afternoon she collapsed in the piano room and Maggie found her curled up beside the pedals, cold sweat soaking her forehead. Luciano took her to a leading gynecologist at Weill Cornell Hospital that very night. The ultrasound results, blood tests, and magnetic resonance imaging 3 days later condemned her with words she would never forget. Severe stage polycystic ovarian cysts, widespread endometrial damage. The chance of natural pregnancy was almost 0. The doctor said many other things too, about artificial insemination, about rare chances, about surgeries they could try. But Isabella couldn't hear anything after that first sentence. She sat there in the cold leather chair, gripping Luciano's hand tightly, and felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. She knew exactly what that meant to a man who carried the Falcone name. Luciano didn't say a word during the entire ride home that night. He only held her in his arms inside the Rolls-Royce, his large hand resting on her head, and his breathing seemed a little heavier than usual. But he didn't cry. He didn't get angry. He didn't ask anything at all. And it was that silence that began planting inside Isabella a fear she couldn't name. The news spread through the family faster than she had imagined. The first person to test her was Aunt Giovanna Falcone, the younger sister of the late Don Emilio, a 71-year-old woman with perfectly dyed black hair and lips that were always curved into a smile Isabella had learned never reached her eyes. Giovanna brought a bouquet of white lilies to the mansion one afternoon, sat in the tea room, and spoke words of sympathy sweetened with poison. She asked Isabella about her treatment plan. She told the story of a relative in Sicily who had once been infertile, then whose husband divorced her and married another woman, and then had 5 children. She said Falcone men always needed an heir, that it was a tradition going back 300 years, and that a dawn without a son was a dawn without a future. Every sentence of hers was wrapped in sweetness, but it pierced Isabella's heart like needles dipped in venom. From then on, every Friday evening, when the family gathered at the Falcone mansion for the traditional dinner, the grand dining room became the most refined chamber of emotional torture Isabella had ever endured. Giovanna always sat to Luciano's left, her syrupy voice mentioning the newborn grandchild of a capo, or the ultrasound image of a business partner's soon-to-be-born son. Tommaso Falcone, Giovanna's 39-year-old son, a second-tier capo with serpent-like eyes, always looked at Isabella's stomach with undisguised contempt. The older capos, sometimes drunk, would speak in Italian, thinking Isabella didn't understand. saying things about how a family couldn't be built on an empty womb. Isabella learned how to eat without tasting anything, how to smile without feeling joy, how to sit with her back straight while everything inside her was falling apart. And Luciano, he remained silent. He never stopped Giovanna. He never defended her in public. He only held her hand beneath the table and squeezed it tightly, like a whisper no one else could hear. But for a woman who was drowning, a hand held beneath the table wasn't enough to pull her back above the water. Last week, on the night of Giovanna's 71st birthday, she hosted a party at her private mansion in Scarsdale. 20 core members of the family were present: the capos, the old consigliere, the distant aunts. After dessert, Giovanna rose and lifted her glass. And in front of the entire family, in front of Luciano, in front of Isabella, she spoke in a voice as clear as a sentence being handed down. She said it was time for Don Falcone to think seriously about the future of the bloodline. She said love was a private matter, but blood was a matter of 300 years. She said that if necessary, the family would help the Don find a new wife who was capable of bearing a son. The whole room went silent as a cemetery. Every pair of eyes turned to Luciano, and Luciano, the husband Isabella had loved so deeply she could hardly breathe, said nothing. He didn't object. He didn't stand up to protect her. He only set his wineglass down, looked at the table, and stayed silent. That silence, beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Scarsdale mansion, became the final drop that overflowed the cup Isabella had been carrying for too long. She went home that night, sat beside the Steinway all night without sleeping, and by dawn, she knew what she had to do. And now, 7 days after the night in Scarsdale, Isabella was sitting in the very living room she had once called home, facing the man she had once called her husband, with the divorce papers lying between them like a blade already sharpened. The fire in the hearth was still burning, but Isabella could no longer feel any warmth. She had cried herself empty since the afternoon, and now there was only a heavy hollowness pressing down on her chest. The lawyers from both sides had left an hour earlier, leaving them with the final agreement and a glossy black Mont Blanc pen resting at an angle on the paper. She only needed to sign, just one signature, and she would be free to become Isabella Hartwell again, the girl who taught piano at Juilliard, the girl who had never stepped into a world of blood and power. Just one signature, and Luciano would be free to find a woman who could give him the sons his bloodline demanded. She drew in a deep breath, trying not to look at his face, because she knew if she looked, she wouldn't have enough courage left to hold the pen. Isabella reached out, her fingers cold as stone, and lifted the pen from the walnut table. It was heavier than she had expected, or perhaps her hand had grown weak without her realizing it. She bent over the paper, placed the tip of the pen on the line reserved for the wife's signature, and began writing the first letter of her name. The letter I curved upward with a trembling stroke, the first dark black line cutting into the white paper like a wound. That was when the room began to spin. The flames in the fireplace suddenly blurred into long orange streaks. The crystal chandelier above her head dissolved into thousands of glittering fragments of light, like falling stars. The scent of Cuban tobacco that Luciano often smoked, the scent she had loved with an almost aching addiction for the past 4 years, suddenly became so suffocating that she couldn't breathe. Her stomach twisted violently, and a wave of nausea surged all the way up her throat. Her ears began ringing with a distant bell, louder and louder, drowning out even the crackle of the fire. She heard the Mont Blanc pen fall onto the wooden table, then roll down onto the Persian rug with a faint sound that seemed to come from another world. She tried to say something. She tried to say she was fine. She tried to say his name, but her tongue was heavy as lead, her throat was dry as sand, and her entire body began tilting forward slowly, beyond her control. The last thing Isabella saw before the darkness swallowed her was Luciano's face, no longer the cold mask of a Don, but the face of a man who had just watched his world collapse in 2 seconds. His ice-blue eyes widened, his pupils shrinking in terror, and his whole towering body lunged across the walnut table before her mind could even process that he was moving. She felt his arms, the arms that had killed men, the arms that had held her hand beneath the dining table, the arms that had rested gently on her stomach every night before sleep, now wrapping around her as firmly as a wall of steel. Her head pressed against his chest. The scent of sandalwood cologne on his collar was the only thing still anchoring her to reality. And then, from somewhere very far away, as though echoing through a long tunnel, she heard his voice. Not the calm, deep voice of a Don giving orders, not the cold voice of the man who had sat in silence on the night in Scarsdale. It was a voice Isabella had never heard in all 4 years of being his wife. A broken voice. The voice of a man losing the only thing he had left in his life. Bella. He roared her name, and it was the last sound she heard before the darkness pulled her all the way down. Bella, don't leave me. Don't leave me, cara mia. When Isabella woke, the first thing she recognized was the familiar lavender scent of the pillows. She was lying on the king-size bed in the master bedroom of the mansion, no longer wearing the ash-gray wool dress, but dressed in a white silk nightgown that someone had carefully helped her into. The bedside lamp was dimmed, casting a warm golden circle of light over her face. For one brief moment between dream and reality, she almost forgot that only a few hours earlier, she had tried to sign the divorce papers. Then the memory came rushing back like a wave, and she wanted to cry again, but her body was too exhausted to do anything except open her eyes. Sitting beside the bed was a man around 50 years old in a pale blue shirt, a stethoscope around his neck, an open medical file resting on his lap. Dr. Harrison Wells, the Falcone family's private physician for the past 15 years, the only man in Manhattan's medical world respected enough and discreet enough to set foot inside this house. He gave a slight nod when he saw her open her eyes, then placed his hand on her wrist to take her pulse with the calm of someone who had witnessed too many tragedies in his profession. At the far end of the room, with his back to the bed, Luciano stood by the large window overlooking the garden veiled in night mist. He had taken off his Brioni jacket and wore only a white shirt with the collar pulled crooked. His left hand gripped a glass of whiskey that was already nearly half empty. His shoulders were so tense that beneath the thin fabric, Isabella could see every hard line of muscle drawn tight. He didn't turn around. He couldn't turn around. Dr. Wells finished his examination, removed the stethoscope from around his neck, and spoke in a gentle voice, as though telling a story to a child. Her blood pressure had fallen to an alarming level. Her blood sugar was also below the safe threshold. He said this was most likely the result of prolonged stress, lack of sleep, and possibly the fact that she had skipped meals for several days. He instructed her to rest for at least 1 week, drink enough water, eat 3 full meals a day, and absolutely avoid any intense emotion. He prescribed a few iron and vitamin supplements, closed the medical file, and stood up. Before leaving, he glanced toward Luciano, and the eyes of the two men met for only one brief second. No words were spoken, but Isabella understood that Dr. Wells had received a sum large enough to make sure no information would ever leave this room. The wooden door closed behind him with a soft click, and Luciano still stood there, his back turned, not looking at her. Isabella wanted to say something, wanted to call his name, but her throat tightened. She didn't know whether, after tonight, they were still anything to each other at all. It was in that painful silence that the bedroom door opened softly for the second time. Magdalena O'Sullivan, the 62-year-old housekeeper with her silver hair neatly pinned at the back of her neck, stepped in with a tray of hot ginger tea in her hands. She had cared for the Falcone mansion for the past 4 years, and Isabella had never once seen her unsettled in any situation. She had always been the embodiment of calm, a steady hand inside a house full of storms. But tonight, when she set the tea tray down on the bedside table, Isabella realized that her hands were trembling. Not the trembling of old age. It was the trembling of someone trying to say something they had hidden for far too long. Magdalena looked at Isabella, then at Luciano, who still stood with his back turned by the window. She drew in a deep breath, as if gathering the courage of an entire lifetime. Her voice rose, soft but clear, ringing like a bell in the night. "Don Falcone, I'd like to say one thing." Luciano didn't turn around. "Say it, Maggie. Dr. Wells is a good doctor, but he's a doctor for men." Magdalena paused, her hands tightening around the edge of her apron. "I have cared for 12 children in my life, sir. I helped deliver 3 women's babies when I was still in Italy. I have seen these signs too many times to mistake them." The entire room fell so silent that they could hear the faint crackle of the fireplace below drifting up through the wooden floor. Luciano slowly, very slowly, turned around. His ice-blue eyes, the eyes that had made all of Manhattan afraid, were fixed on Magdalena with something Isabella couldn't name. "What are you saying, Maggie?" Magdalena didn't look away from him. She spoke the next sentence with the certainty of a vow made before an altar. "Isabella isn't only stressed, Don. She's pregnant." The whiskey glass slipped from Luciano's fingers, the same fingers that had been gripping it tightly for the past 3 hours. It fell onto the deep red Persian rug with a heavy sound, rolled a few times, and stopped right beneath his feet. No one bent down to pick it up. No one breathed. There were only 3 hearts beating in that room, and each heart had just crossed a threshold from which there would never be a way back. Luciano didn't sleep that night. Isabella knew it, because every time she opened her eyes, even for only 1 second between broken stretches of sleep, she saw him sitting in the armchair pulled close beside the bed, his elbows braced on his knees, his eyes never leaving her stomach. He didn't touch her. He didn't say a word. He only sat there, as if the miracle Magdalena had just spoken aloud would disappear if he blinked for too long. By 5 in the morning, while the Manhattan sky was still black as ink, he called Vincenzo Bianchi in a low voice that allowed no refusal. Half an hour later, the black Rolls-Royce Phantom was parked in front of the mansion, and Isabella was carried down the stairs in Luciano's own arms, wrapped in his cashmere wool coat, capped, even though she had insisted that she could walk. He didn't say no. He simply didn't listen. At 6 in the morning, the private VIP floor at Mount Sinai Hospital opened a separate entrance for them. There was no waiting room, no name displayed on a registration screen, no nurse asking for paperwork. Dr. Elena Whitmore, an obstetrician nearly 60 years old, with short gray streaked hair and experienced gray eyes, was already waiting for them in a private ultrasound room. Luciano had called her at 4 in the morning and transferred enough money for her to cancel every appointment she had that day. Isabella lay down on the examination table, her robe lifted, and her body trembled when the ultrasound probe touched the cold gel on her abdomen. Luciano stood beside her, his left hand holding her right, and for the first time in her life, Isabella felt his pulse racing faster than her own. The black and white screen filled with blurred outlines, and then Dr. Whitmore stopped the probe. She was silent for a few seconds, adjusted the angle, and turned the screen toward them. "This is your baby." Her voice was gentle but certain. 8 weeks. Heartbeat at 163 beats per minute. Completely healthy. A tiny point flickered on the screen, steady as a distant star with a heartbeat. Isabella stared at that image and felt tears spill uncontrollably from her eyes. Luciano's hand tightened around hers until it hurt. Dr. Whitmore continued examining her for several more minutes, then took out Isabella's old medical file and compared it with the new results. She removed her glasses, wiped them with the edge of her white coat, then put them back on, her face unable to hide its astonishment. "I reviewed the records from Weill Cornell Hospital 2 years ago, the polycystic ovarian cysts, the endometrial damage. Everything was clearly documented." She paused, looking at Isabella as though she were looking at some strange wonder of nature. "But today's ultrasound shows that the cysts have completely resolved on their own. The endometrium has recovered. In medicine, we call this spontaneous conception, natural conception beyond all predictions. It happens in about 1 out of hundreds of thousands of cases. I've been practicing for 30 years, and I've only seen this 3 times. She turned to Luciano, who was standing like a statue. "Don Falcone, your wife and the baby are both very healthy, but she needs special care during the first 3 months. No stress, no excessive movement, no emotional shocks of any kind." Luciano only nodded once, and Isabella saw his jaw clench so tightly that a tendon rose along his cheek. On the way back to the mansion, the Manhattan sun had just risen over the East River horizon, tinting the glass buildings along Park Avenue pink. The Rolls-Royce moved slowly through streets that were still nearly empty, and inside the warm, leather-scented cabin, no one said a word. Isabella looked out the window, her hand resting on her stomach, and felt everything inside her being rearranged into a new order she hadn't yet learned how to name. Luciano sat beside her, his large body taking up almost the entire back seat, and after a long while without touching her, he slowly placed his right hand on her thigh, not to guide her, not to possess her, only a gentle touch, as if he were trying to remind himself that she was still there, that the small miracle inside her was real. He squeezed lightly, just once, without a word. But Isabella, after 4 years of learning how to read this man's silences, understood that it was the first apology he had ever given her. When the Rolls-Royce stopped before the iron gates of the Falcone mansion, the sun had risen higher than the buildings of the Upper East Side, casting its light down over the snow gathered on the carefully trimmed cedar shrubs lining the driveway. Luciano stepped out first, walked around the car, and opened the door for Isabella himself. He didn't let her step down from the curb on her own. He supported her with both hands, one behind her back, one lifting her elbow, as if within the past 12 hours she had become something made of glass. Inside the grand foyer, Magdalena was waiting for them, with a cashmere shawl in her hands, and undisguised worry in her eyes. She didn't ask anything, only looked toward Luciano. He gave a slight nod, and in Magdalena's eyes, Isabella saw something break open into quiet joy, a trembling smile appearing at the corner of her mouth before she turned away to hide it. Luciano led Isabella straight back to the living room, the room where only last night they had nearly ended their marriage. The fireplace was still smoldering from the night before, red coals glowing beneath a layer of white ash. The divorce papers were still lying on the walnut table, the Mont Blanc pen resting at an angle beside them, the letter I she had barely managed to write still there like an unhealed wound. Luciano stood looking at the paper for a long time. Then, without saying a word, he stepped forward, lifted the document with both hands, and began to tear it. He tore it once lengthwise, then a second time, then a third. White scraps of paper fell onto the carpet like snow. When the document had become nothing more than small fragments, he gathered them in his large palm, walked to the fireplace, and threw them all into the flames. The pieces of paper caught fire at once, curling, turning black, then vanishing into ash. Luciano stood watching until the final scrap had burned away. After that, he turned back, and for the first time that morning, he looked directly into her eyes. He walked over, knelt before the armchair where Isabella was sitting, his brioni-covered knees touching the Persian rug, and took her hand between both of his. That gesture, from a man who had never knelt before anyone in his life, made Isabella hold her breath. Bella, his voice was low, no longer shattered like it had been last night, but there was something bare inside it that she had never heard before. I need you to listen to me, and I need to say this only once. She nodded, not daring to open her mouth. When I was 4 years old, my father told me my mother had died of heart disease. I still remember that day. I was sitting in my mother's piano room, waiting for her to come back and teach me a new piece. But she didn't come back, and my father came in, sat beside me, and told me that from that day on, I no longer had a mother. I cried for one night. After that, my father told me Falcone men don't cry, so I stopped crying. Forever. His hand tightened around hers a little. When I was 12 years old, I was sitting in the car with my father on the way home from St. Patrick's Cathedral. Another car pulled up beside us. I watched my father get shot 3 times right next to me. His blood splattered across my face. I sat beside his body for 20 minutes before the family's men arrived, and from that day on, I learned that loving someone meant giving the world a weapon to hurt you. I spent the next 6 years learning how not to love. When I was 18, I sat in the Don's chair where my father had once sat, and I became very good at not loving, until you walked into my study 4 years ago. His ice blue eyes reddened, not with tears, only with something inside him breaking open after 32 years. I loved you from that moment, Bella. I loved you when I placed the Steinway in the room in the East Wing. I loved you every Sunday when you told me about Chopin. I loved you the night you sat beside the fireplace playing the nocturne, and I stood in the doorway, not daring to step inside. But I didn't know how to say it. I'd never learned. And when you were diagnosed, I thought the best way to love you was to stay silent, to let you decide for yourself, to not force you to stay with a man who didn't deserve you. I was wrong. I was terribly wrong, Bella. I didn't love you enough. I'm sorry. Isabella couldn't hold back anymore. She fell forward, wrapped her arms around his neck, and cried. She cried for 4 years of silence. She cried for the 4-year-old boy who had lost his mother. She cried for the 12-year-old boy who had sat beside his father's body. She cried for both of them, who had almost lost each other. Luciano held her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair, and his shoulders shook in a silent way that only she could feel. That night, for the first time in months, they slept in the same bed. There was nothing more than his arms around her from behind, his hand resting on her stomach, and the steady rhythm of their breathing blending together in the darkness. Isabella slept through the night for the first time since the day she learned she was infertile, and Luciano lay awake the entire night, his hand never leaving her stomach for even a second, as if he were afraid that if he slept, this whole miracle would disappear. 2 months passed like a dream Isabella still didn't dare believe was real. Manhattan entered the harshest midwinter it had seen in 10 years, with snow falling so heavily that there were mornings when Madison Avenue had to be closed so snowplows could pass through, and the Falcone mansion became a warm fortress in the middle of the white world outside. The strangest thing wasn't the snow. The strangest thing was that Luciano was home, the man whom, for the past 4 years, Isabella had only seen as a retreating back, leaving the mansion before dawn and returning after midnight, now sat across from her at the breakfast table every morning, drinking black coffee, reading the Wall Street paper, and looking up to smile whenever she yawned. He summoned Vincenzo Bianchi to the mansion library one evening in late November, and after a conversation that lasted 2 hours behind closed doors, Vincenzo stepped out with a thick stack of files under his arm and a new weight on his shoulders. 80% of the family's work, from the Brooklyn port contracts, the relationships with the families in Chicago and Philadelphia, to the daily decisions about personnel and territory, was transferred to Vincenzo's management. Luciano kept only the most critical strategic decisions. He was still the Don, but the Don was now at home. Every day, from 10 in the morning until 12 noon, he sat in the second-floor library, a walnut-paneled room with bookshelves reaching all the way to the ceiling, and a granite fireplace always smoldering quietly. Senior capos came to report, consigliere came to request signatures, and Vincenzo came to discuss matters that needed the Don's opinion. At exactly 12 o'clock, Luciano closed the library door and accepted no further meetings. The rest of the day belonged to Isabella. He went with her to every ultrasound appointment at Mount Sinai Hospital, sitting in the plastic chair beside the examination table, holding her hand, his eyes fixed on the screen whenever Dr. Whitmore pointed out each tiny part of the baby. In the 12th week, they heard the heartbeat clearly for the first time through the amplifier. In the 16th week, Dr. Whitmore said they would be able to know the baby's sex at the next appointment if they wanted to. Luciano looked at Isabella, and she only shook her head. She wanted to keep that secret until the very last minute. He agreed without the slightest hesitation. On the way home, inside the warm Rolls-Royce, he held her hand and said that whether it was a boy or a girl, this child was already his entire world. Isabella suffered from severe morning sickness throughout the first trimester. The smell of coffee made her nauseous. The smell of beef sent her rushing into the bathroom. But there were nights in the middle of the night when her stomach suddenly craved something so specific that she couldn't fall back asleep. One night in early January, while snow was falling thickly outside the windows and the wind howled past the distant bell towers of St. Patrick's Cathedral, Isabella woke at 2 in the morning with a strange craving for a bowl of Italian chicken soup Magdalena had made for her once 3 weeks earlier. She tried to go back to sleep. She couldn't. She turned over. Luciano woke immediately, driven by the instinct of a Don who remained alert even in sleep. He asked if she was all right. She shyly told him about her craving for chicken soup. He sat up, kissed her forehead, and told her to stay in bed. Isabella thought he would wake Magdalena, but after 20 minutes passed without any sound of footsteps in the hallway, curiosity made her put on a robe and go downstairs. The mansion's large kitchen was glowing with warm yellow light, and there, in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, the Falcone falcon ring placed neatly on the marble counter, Don Luciano Falcone was standing in front of the stove, a white linen apron tied around his waist, holding Magdalena's old recipe notebook in his hand. The housekeeper was sitting on a high stool by the counter, guiding him step by step in a patient voice, as though teaching a child. 3 stalks of celery. No. Chop them smaller than that. Put the chicken into cold water, not boiling water. The onion has to be browned in olive oil before it goes into the pot. Luciano followed each instruction with the serious concentration he usually reserved for million-dollar negotiations. Isabella stood still in the kitchen doorway, one hand resting on the stomach that had begun to round softly, and felt tears roll down her cheeks before she even knew they were there. The man before her, the Don of the most feared mafia family in Manhattan, was learning how to cook a bowl of chicken soup at 2 in the morning simply because his wife was craving it. And in that moment, Isabella knew she was no longer the Isabella Hartwell who had signed that marriage contract 4 years ago. She had become something else. She had become his home. From the night at 2 in the morning in that kitchen, the friendship between Isabella and Magdalena gradually became one of the most precious things in her life. With the pregnancy now entering its 20th week and the last of the morning sickness finally easing, Isabella had more time to spend in the small sitting room on the first floor, where there was a limestone fireplace, 2 deep blue velvet armchairs, and a large window looking out onto the snow-covered garden. Every afternoon around 3 o'clock, while Luciano was still busy with his final meetings in the library on the second floor, Magdalena would bring in a pot of chamomile tea and a plate of homemade Italian butter cookies. The 2 women sat across from each other without turning on the lights, letting only the firelight from the hearth dance across the walls. They talked about small things. Magdalena told her about her homeland in Sicily, about the villages on the slopes of Mount Etna, where every family had its own lemon grove. Isabella spoke of her years at Juilliard, of her first performance before an audience at Carnegie Hall when she was 19. They never spoke directly about Don Falcone, but his name slipped into both their stories like a red thread, and it was in those seemingly harmless conversations that Isabella began to notice things her reason couldn't explain. The first time was on a Thursday morning, while Luciano was meeting in the library with a partner from Philadelphia. Magdalena came in with a coffee tray, set it on Luciano's desk, and left without waiting for a thank you. Isabella, who was sitting in the reading chair near the door, looked over with curiosity. His coffee was a double espresso with no sugar, made from dark roasted Sicilian Arabica beans, with exactly 3 drops of whole milk added. Isabella had been beside him for 4 years, and she had only learned that exact formula after 3 years of living with him. But Magdalena had known it from the first day she stepped into this mansion 4 years ago. No one had taught her. No one had given her the recipe. She simply knew. Isabella asked Luciano about it at dinner the next evening. Casually. He shrugged and said perhaps he had told her. But when Isabella asked Magdalena again the following afternoon, the older woman only smiled gently and said she had guessed by the way he drank it. The second time happened during the 22nd week of the pregnancy. Luciano caught a severe cold after standing in the courtyard for nearly an hour during a snowstorm to see off a group of capos. He developed a fever that night, his temperature reaching 39 degrees, and Isabella was so frightened that she was about to call Dr. Wells even though it was almost midnight. But Magdalena walked into the master bedroom with a white porcelain teapot already prepared, poured out a cup of ginger tea mixed with wild honey and a slice of Meyer lemon. She handed the cup to Luciano, and he, though so exhausted he was nearly delirious, took it and drank it all without asking a single question. By the next morning, the fever had gone down. Isabella asked him about that tea, and he said it was the only thing that had been able to cure his cold since he was a child. No one in the mansion knew that recipe except the person who had first made it for him when he had a fever at 3 years old. And that person, he said in a distant voice, had been gone for a long time. Isabella said nothing, but that night, after Luciano had fallen asleep, she lay awake staring at the ceiling for a very long time, her heart beating in a strange way. The third time happened on a February morning, when Isabella was sitting in the breakfast room waiting for Luciano to come down. Rare winter sunlight streamed through the tall window, spilling a pale golden stripe across the table. Magdalena came in carrying a tray of toast, and when she leaned forward to set the plate down, the sunlight fell directly across her face. Isabella looked up, and for 1 second, she forgot how to breathe. Magdalena's eyes in that sunlight were not an ordinary blue. They were a rare ice blue, cold and clear as frozen river water, with silver flecks glittering around the pupils. The exact same eye color, the exact same silver flecks, the exact same slightly lifted shape at the outer corners as the eyes of the man Isabella had slept beside for the past 4 years. Magdalena set the tray down, stepped back, and left the room with the quiet footsteps of someone who had grown used to hiding herself. Isabella sat motionless before the plate of toast, her heart pounding inside her chest. A thought began forming in her mind, a thought so strange that she didn't dare give it a name. But once that seed had been planted, she knew that sooner or later, it would begin to grow. The seed sprouted sooner than Isabella had expected. 3 nights after the morning she had seen Magdalena's eyes in the sunlight, she couldn't sleep. The baby had begun kicking harder since the 23rd week, and tonight, the little kicks kept coming, one after another, leaving her restless until 2 in the morning. Luciano slept deeply beside her, one hand resting on her stomach as he did every night. She gently lifted his hand away, put on the gray cashmere wool robe, and went downstairs in her soft fur slippers. The mansion at night was so silent that she could hear the pendulum clock in the grand foyer marking time with its steady rhythm. She meant to go down to the kitchen for a glass of warm milk with honey, the drink Magdalena had taught her to make so she could sleep more easily. But when she came near the wooden kitchen door, she stopped. The kitchen light was on, not the main light, but the small lamp beside the marble counter, and through the narrow gap in the half-open door, she heard a sound that made her heart tighten. Crying. Small, quiet. The crying of someone who had cried too many times in life and had learned how to press the sobs down inside her chest so no one else would hear. Isabella stood motionless in the hallway for nearly 1 minute. Then she gently pushed the door open. Magdalena was sitting at the long wooden table where the household staff ate breakfast. Her silver hair no longer pinned as neatly as it was during the day, with several loose strands falling over her shoulders. She was holding something in her trembling hands, and tears ran down her wrinkled cheeks without her bothering to wipe them away. On the table in front of her was a small wooden box with its lid open, and inside were several yellowed letters, an old lace-embroidered handkerchief, and a small silver cross necklace. Magdalena looked up when she heard the door, but she didn't have time to hide what she was holding. Isabella stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and moved closer to the table with slow footsteps. The housekeeper looked at her, her eyes still wet, and she seemed too tired to hide anything anymore. Isabella sat down in the chair across from her. The soft yellow light fell over the object in Magdalena's hands. It was a black and white photograph that had faded into brownish yellow with the years, its corners frayed, a small crack running across the middle, as though it had been folded many times before. In the photograph was a young woman, around 30 years old, wearing a light summer dress with a thin shawl over her shoulders. She was holding a boy of about 3 in her arms, pressing her cheek against his thick black hair. Behind the mother and child, the stone steps and 2 tall bell towers of St. Patrick's Cathedral stood clearly in the sunlight. The woman was smiling, and her aunt, even through a faded black and white photograph, still glittered with the same clear, cold light Isabella had recognized the other morning. The little boy in her arms, with his still innocent round face, his small, slightly pointed chin, and his distinct straight eyebrows, was a miniature version of the man sleeping upstairs. Isabella looked at the photograph. Then she looked at Magdalena. Then she looked at the photograph again. Her hands began to tremble. Her voice escaped like a breath that didn't have enough air. "Maggie, who are you?" Magdalena did not answer right away. She looked at the photograph in her hand for a little while longer, then gently placed it down on the wooden table between them, as if she had been waiting for this moment for 32 years, and now no longer had the strength to stretch that waiting out for even 1 more minute. She drew in a long breath, trembling as she inhaled, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer the voice of Maggie O'Sullivan, the housekeeper Isabella had known for the past 4 years. It was the voice of a woman who had been silent for far too long. "My real name is Magdalena Russo Falconi. I was born in Palermo, Sicily, in 1961. And the woman in this photograph, she is me from 32 years ago." Isabella sat frozen. Magdalena continued, her voice flat and steady, as though she were reading a story that didn't belong to her. She had met Don Emilio Falcone in the summer when she was 24, when he came to Sicily on a family business trip. He had been a widower for 3 years, and when he saw her working in her parents' flower shop on Via Maqueda, he came back every day for 2 straight weeks, just to buy a different bouquet. 6 months later, she followed him to Manhattan as Don Falcone's official second wife. She was 25 years old, and she loved that man with the whole heart of a girl who had just left her homeland for the first time. 1 year later, Luciana was born at a private hospital on the Upper East Side. She had held her son in her arms and sworn before God that she would teach him how to love, how to care, how to laugh, even if he carried Falcone blood inside him. Those first years were the happiest years of her life. But there was one person in that house who never accepted her. Giovanna Falcone, Emilio's younger sister, who was 39 at the time, had lived in the Falcone mansion her entire life. She had grown used to controlling everything while Emilio was widowed. And the arrival of Magdalena, a young, beautiful Sicilian girl with rare ice-blue eyes and the ability to make Don Emilio laugh like an ordinary man, became a threat Giovanna couldn't accept. When Luciana was 4 years old, Giovanna made her move. She hired a young man to pretend to be Magdalena's former lover from Sicily, staged a meeting at a cafe in Little Italy, and hired a photographer to take carefully manipulated photographs that appeared to show Magdalena embracing and kissing that man. She also forged love letters in handwriting made to look exactly like Magdalena's. Then she placed all the evidence on Don Emilio's desk. Emilio Falcone was a man who loved his wife deeply, and because he loved deeply, he became blindly furious. He didn't ask Magdalena a single question. He didn't give her a chance to explain. That night, he woke her at 2 in the morning, threw the evidence onto the bed, and ordered 2 guards to take her out of the mansion immediately. She wasn't allowed to bring anything except the clothes she was wearing. She wasn't allowed to enter her son's room to say goodbye. She wasn't allowed to set foot in Manhattan again. If she came back, he swore he would kill her. Magdalena stopped speaking for a while, her trembling hands taking hold of the photograph. The only thing I managed to do before they pushed me into the car was sneak into my son's room. Luciano was sleeping. I kissed his forehead and whispered that his mother would always love him, even if he never knew it. The next morning, Emilio told Luciano that his mother had died of heart disease in the night. He believed it. What does a 4-year-old know except to believe? She lived under a hidden identity in Brooklyn for the next 28 years. She changed her surname to O'Sullivan, the surname of an Irish friend who had helped her get new papers. She worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families in Park Slope and Cobble Hill, moving every 5 years, so no one would recognize her. She followed news about the Falcone family through the newspapers. She knew when Emilio was assassinated. She knew when Luciano inherited his position at 18. She had stood 1 block away from St. Patrick's Cathedral on the day of Don Emilio's funeral, wearing a dark coat with a scarf covering half her face, just to see her son from a distance one time. 4 years ago, when I read in the newspaper that Luciano had married you, I knew this was the final chance of my life. I hired someone to create a new file for Maggie O'Sullivan, 58 years old, a housekeeper with 30 years of experience. I passed 3 rounds of interviews with the Falcone security team. And when I stepped into the mansion for the first time after 28 years, I could barely stay on my feet. My Luciano, my 4-year-old boy, had become a 32-year-old man with eyes exactly like mine and a voice exactly like his father's. Isabella had been crying without knowing when the tears had started. She stood, walked around the table, and wrapped her arms tightly around the older woman, the stronger woman, the woman who had suffered far more than she had. Maggie, no, Magdalena, you have to tell him. He has lived 32 years believing his mother was dead. He needs to know the truth. Magdalena shook her head, tears falling onto Isabella's shoulder. Not yet, my child. Giovanna is still there. That woman killed me once with a lie. If she knows I'm alive and have been inside this house for 4 years, she won't stop at a second lie. She'll truly kill me. And she'll kill you and the baby inside you too. I have waited 32 years. I can wait a little longer until we find a safe way. While Isabella and Magdalena were holding each other and crying in the darkened kitchen at 2 a.m, 15 blocks north of the Falcone mansion, at the Scarsdale estate, Giovanna Falcone had just slammed down the phone with enough force to make the crystal base let out a small crack. The person who had called her was a young nurse named Paulina, working in the maternity ward at Mount Sinai Hospital, a girl who had accepted Giovanna's thick envelopes for the past 2 years in exchange for reporting any information related to Don Falcone's wife. And tonight, Paulina had called to deliver a piece of news Giovanna had been certain would never happen. Isabella Hartwell was pregnant, 23 weeks, a baby girl, perfectly healthy. Giovanna sank into the red velvet armchair in her private room, her hands trembling from a rage she had held back for 3 decades, now suddenly surging up beyond her control. 32 years ago, she had taken everything from Magdalena to make sure the Don's chair would remain in a bloodline she could control. 18 years ago, when Luciano rose to power at the age of 18, she had swallowed her anger because that boy had not become the pliable tool she thought he would be. She had spent the next 18 years quietly shaping Tommaso, her only son, into a second-tier capo respected by the other capos, ready to inherit if Luciano had no son. And now, when Isabella had been diagnosed as infertile 2 years earlier, when Giovanna's plan had nearly reached completion after so many years of patient waiting, the very daughter-in-law, who should have signed the divorce papers last month, was carrying inside her the one who would steal everything away. She did not hesitate for even one more night. At 7 o'clock the next evening, Giovanna Falcone, wearing a black mink coat that fell to her ankles, stepped out of her private Mercedes Maybach and entered a nightclub called Zolotoy Kliuk, hidden deep inside a quiet street in Forest Hills, Queens. The club belonged to the Bratva, the Russian mafia group that controlled most of Brighton Beach, and had been the Falcone family's sworn enemy for the past 20 years. Inside, past dim red-lit corridors and a steel door guarded by 2 large bodyguards, she was led into a private room in the basement, where Matthias Kovac was waiting. Kovac was 45 years old, the Pakan of the New York Bratva, a large man with the gray eyes of a wolf too familiar with blood. 2 8-pointed star tattoos sat symmetrically on his collarbones, the mark of the highest rank in the Russian criminal world. He did not stand when Giovanna entered. He only gestured for her to sit in the chair across from him. Giovanna placed a small leather briefcase on the table and did not touch the vodka the server had already poured. She went straight to the point. Don Falcone's wife was pregnant with a baby girl. In 4 months, the child would be born, and that event would officially lock Luciano's position within the family for one more generation. Giovanna wanted that not to happen. She wanted Isabella Hartwell handled in a way that would leave no trace leading back to the Falcone family or to herself. In exchange, she would provide the Bratva with the full operating schedule for 30% of the Red Hook port territory in Brooklyn, including the warehouses, container ship schedules, and the list of capos in charge. She would clear the way for the Bratva to seize that territory within the next 6 months without organized resistance. Matthias Kovac took a sip of vodka and looked at her with unblinking gray eyes. Then he gave a small laugh, the kind that did not reach his eyes. He said he had waited 20 years to hear an offer like this from someone inside the Falcone family itself. They shook hands across the table, and in that handshake between 2 old and cold hands, Isabella Hartwell's death sentence was signed. 3 weeks after the meeting at Zolotoy Kliuch, at 4:17 on Wednesday morning, Red Hook Harbor in Brooklyn was shaken by an explosion so powerful that the windows of apartments 3 blocks away cracked. Flames rose more than 60 feet high, staining one corner of the Brooklyn sky red in the cold rain of early March. By 5 in the morning, when Vincenzo Bianchi arrived at the scene in a black leather coat thrown on in haste, the New York Fire Department had already sealed off the entire area. Warehouse number 7, one of the Falcone family's 12 strategic warehouses at the port, had burned completely to the ground. 30 containers of legal shipment goods used for the family's business front were destroyed. 3 men working the night shift didn't make it out in time. They were young capos, whom Luciano had personally brought into the family 3 years earlier. Boys he had once regarded like younger brothers. Vincenzo looked at the 3 bodies being pulled from the ashes, and his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth made a sound. He took out his phone and made only 1 call. Luciano answered after 2 rings. By 7 in the morning, Luciano was standing inside the family's security command room in the basement of the Falcone mansion, an armored room with 12 large screens showing live feeds from the security cameras of every family property across New York City. He hadn't slept. Isabella was still asleep upstairs, and he had left Magdalena sitting watch beside her bed, allowing no one else to enter the master bedroom without a direct order from him. Vincenzo had laid everything out over 20 minutes. Warehouse number 7 had not been a random target. It was the only warehouse during those 3 nights that had enough cargo inside to create an explosion large enough to draw media attention. And the schedule of the young capos working that night shift had only been decided on Monday afternoon, 2 days before the explosion. Luciano walked to the central screen, one hand resting on the edge of the cold metal table. His ice-blue eyes no longer held even a trace of emotion. The look the older capos had learned meant death was drawing near for someone. He spoke in a low, even voice. Who knew that schedule? Vincenzo gave 7 names. 4 of them were first-tier capos Luciano had trusted absolutely for 10 years. 2 were old consiglieri, who had served the family since Don Emilio's time. The 7th was Tommaso Falcone. Luciano showed no reaction when he heard Tommaso's surname. He only signaled for Vincenzo to continue. Over the next 4 hours, the family's technical team reviewed every piece of footage from the security cameras around Scarsdale, Queens, and Brighton Beach. By 11 in the morning, Vincenzo entered Luciano's study with a black hard drive in his hand and an expression he had tried to control but couldn't hide. The footage was played on the large screen. At 7:09 on Monday evening, a black SUV with Russian plates had stopped in front of the gates of Giovanna Falcone's Scarsdale estate. The driver was Dmitry Volkov, the closest right-hand man of Matthias Kovac, the Bratva Pakan. He stayed inside the estate for exactly 53 minutes. When he left, the leather briefcase he had carried in had become 2 briefcases carried out. Luciano watched the footage 3 times. By the 3rd time, he no longer needed to see it. He sat down in the leather chair behind his desk, slowly turning the Falcone falcon ring on his finger. And when he spoke, his voice was terrifyingly calm. Vincenzo, double the security around Isabella from this moment on. No one except you, me, and Magdalena enters her room. None of her appointments happen without 4 guards accompanying her. No car except my Rolls takes her anywhere. Vincenzo nodded. And Giovanna? Luciano looked out the distant window, where snow was beginning to fall again. Not yet. I need her to think she's still safe. And I need to know who else is standing behind her. Magdalena had watched everything that happened over the past 3 weeks with the eyes of a mother who had kept silent for 32 years, and now knew that the time for silence finally had to end. The explosion at Red Hook, the increased security around Isabella, Luciano's long meetings in the basement, all of it told her one thing. Giovanna had made her move, and this time, the person being targeted was not her. It was her unborn grandchild. On Sunday night, 5 days after the explosion, when Luciano took Isabella to church to pray with 3 bodyguards, Magdalena had exactly 40 minutes inside the empty house. She went up to Luciano's study on the 2nd floor, a large walnut-paneled library with an English-style desk set with its back to the tall windows. She opened the small leather satchel she had kept in the drawer of her vanity for the past 4 years. Inside were 3 things. The first was the black and white photograph she had shown Isabella that night in the kitchen. The photograph of her and her son in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral when he was 3 years old. The second was a thick 7-page letter she had written to Emilio Falcone 3 weeks after being driven from the mansion 32 years ago. A letter in which she had written the entire truth about Giovanna, about the man who had pretended to be her former lover, about the doctored photograph. That letter had never been sent, because she knew Emilio would never read a letter from someone he had forbidden to contact him. And the third was the old phone she had hidden in the pocket of her apron 2 weeks earlier, when she had passed through the 1st-floor hallway and accidentally heard Giovanna, visiting the mansion under the name of family business, speaking privately on the phone in the tea room, unaware that the old housekeeper was standing behind the half-open door. Giovanna's voice was clear as day, confessing to an unnamed person on the other end of the line that she had spent 32 years building her current position and wouldn't let the daughter of a Sicilian whore steal everything from her, just as she had removed Luciano's mother from his life all those years ago. Magdalena placed all 3 things on Luciano's desk, directly in the center, where the desk lamp would shine straight down when he sat there. She left no note. Then she went down to the greenhouse at the end of the garden behind the mansion, sat on the wicker chair among the pots of jasmine, and waited. At 9:40 that night, Luciano entered his study to review the security reports one last time before going to bed. The desk lamp was switched on. He saw the photograph. He sat down very slowly. He read the letter from beginning to end, all 7 pages of yellowed paper covered in the slender, slanted handwriting of a young woman. He played the recording on the old phone. He listened to all 5 minutes and 23 seconds of the familiar voice that had raised him for 32 years. When the recording ended, Luciano stood. He walked to the antique liquor cabinet made of walnut inlaid with ivory, set in the corner of the room, where he kept the Scottish whiskey collection his father had left behind. He placed both hands on the glass front of the cabinet, and with a rage that had been building for 32 years, he shoved the entire cabinet onto the wooden floor. Glass shattered, wood cracked, and dozens of bottles broke into glittering shards amid a widening pool of amber liquid spreading across the carpet. 2 guards ran to the door and stopped outside. Luciano only signaled for them to leave, his voice nothing more than a whisper. "Get out. Close the door." He stood alone among that wreckage for a long time, breathing deeply, his shoulders trembling. Then he picked up the photograph from the desk, folded it into his palm, and went down the stairs. He crossed the grand foyer, passed through the living room, then the hallway leading to the garden behind the mansion, and stopped before the glass door of the greenhouse. The lights inside had been turned off. Only moonlight came through the crystal dome above, falling over the pots of jasmine and the old woman sitting on the wicker chair with both hands resting on her lap. Magdalena looked up when he stepped inside. She did not stand. She only looked at him. And for the first time in his adult life, Don Luciano Falcone, the man who had never knelt before anyone, the man all of Manhattan lowered its head for when he passed, walked to the wicker chair, slowly dropped to both knees in front of her, and placed his head on her lap. For a long time, he said nothing. Then his shoulders began to shake, and Don Falcone, at 36 years old, sobbed on his mother's lap like the same 4-year-old child who had once sat waiting for his mother to return from the piano room. Magdalena placed her wrinkled hand on his black hair and stroked it gently, just as she had stroked it 32 years before. She did not say a word. She did not need to. Her tears ran down her cheeks, fell into his hair, and blended with his own. 32 years of silence. 32 years of living without a name. 32 years of a mother forbidden to be called mother. All of it shattered in that little greenhouse, beneath the early March moonlight. among the pots of jasmine she had grown for the past 4 years, only because those were the flowers she had once grown in the garden of her home in Sicily, when little Luciano was still a child, learning to walk. 2 weeks after the night in the greenhouse, Isabella had entered the 28th week of her pregnancy, and her stomach had rounded so visibly that every step she took had to slow by 1 beat. Luciano had not made any move against Giovanna yet, and that was exactly the strategy he and Vincenzo had agreed on. She had to believe she was still safe, so the other links in the conspiracy would reveal themselves. But Giovanna Falcone was a snake that had lived in the grass for far too long not to sense when the ground was shifting. 3 weeks had passed without the Bratva contacting her again after the Red Hook explosion. Her nephew had been unusually silent at the family dinner last week. And worse, she began to notice new guards appearing around the Falcone mansion, faces she did not recognize. She decided she had to act before Luciano acted against her. On Saturday afternoon, at around 2 o'clock, a black Mercedes Maybach stopped in front of the mansion gates. Giovanna stepped out in an elegant gray wool coat, not her usual mink coat, holding a bouquet of white dahlias and a small gift box wrapped in pink tissue paper. Her appearance was that of a remorseful aunt who had come to ask for forgiveness. The housekeeper led her into the living room, where Isabella was reading beside the fireplace. Giovanna sat down, placed the flowers on the table, and said in a trembling voice that she had thought a great deal over the past few months, that she felt terrible about what she had said on the night of her birthday in Scarsdale, that she wanted to apologize to Isabella before the baby was born, so no resentment would be passed down to the little granddaughter. She handed over the gift box, and inside was a gold necklace with a pendant of Saint Anne, the patron saint of mothers and newborns in Italian tradition. Isabella had learned many things in the Falcone world over the past 4 years, and her instincts were screaming that something was wrong. But Giovanna's tears were real, rolling down her wrinkled cheeks, and she asked for only 10 minutes to speak with Isabella privately in the back garden, where they could breathe a little fresh air and both feel more at ease. A woman-to-woman conversation between an aunt and an expectant mother. Luciano was in the basement with Vincenzo handling an urgent security report. Isabella looked out the window. The back garden was full of sunlight. 4 guards were standing in their usual positions, and Giovanna had been part of this family for 30 years. She agreed. The 2 women walked out the back door together. At that exact moment, a food delivery truck that Magdalena had ordered 2 weeks earlier stopped at the mansion's western side gate, and the entire outer security team was redirected to inspect the truck according to standard security procedure. In the exact 4 minutes when the side gate was opened for the goods inspection, a pitch-black Cadillac Escalade SUV rushed through before anyone could react. 3 men dressed in black stepped out from behind the tall yew hedge near the stone bench Giovanna was leading Isabella toward. She didn't have time to scream before a chloroform-soaked cloth was pressed over her face from behind. The chemical smell rushed into her nose. Her hands instinctively flew to her stomach, wanting to protect her child. The last thing she saw before the darkness dragged her down was Giovanna's face. No longer tearful, no longer remorseful, holding only a smile as cold as ice from a woman who had waited 32 years to smile like that. Magdalena was arranging flowers in the kitchen when she heard the hurried footsteps of a guard outside in the yard. She looked out the window just in time to see Giovanna walking toward her Mercedes alone, without Isabella beside her, and the Maybach leaving the mansion at once. She did not need anyone to tell her what had happened. She ran, faster than a 62-year-old woman should have been able to run, down the basement stairs, shoved the door to the security command room open, and screamed one single sentence before collapsing to the floor. Luciano. They took Isabella. Luciano Falcone had witnessed many terrible scenes in his life. He had watched his father get shot 3 times when he was 12. He had killed for the first time at 17. He had ordered executions 4 times with his own voice. But he had never truly known fear until the moment he looked down at his old mother trembling on the floor and understood that the only woman he had ever loved, along with his unborn child, had just been stolen from his home in broad daylight. The color drained from his face. His hand settled on the table, gripping so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When he spoke, his voice was colder than the tomb where his father lay. "Vincenzo, call everyone. Call every person we have. If I don't find her alive within the next 6 hours, I'll burn all of New York to ash, and I'll start with Brighton Beach." The Falcone family's information network was activated at a level Manhattan had not witnessed in the past 20 years. Every capo, every informant, every taxi driver, every restaurant owner who had ever owed Don Falcone a favor received the same call within 15 minutes. The pitch-black Cadillac Escalade SUV, with a license plate captured by a traffic camera, was recorded leaving Manhattan through the Lincoln Tunnel at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon. By 6 o'clock in the evening, Vincenzo had narrowed the search to an abandoned industrial district in eastern Newark, New Jersey, where the Bratva had rented an old warehouse from a steel company that had gone bankrupt the previous year. By 7:20, drones had flown over the area and confirmed at least 7 armed men inside the warehouse complex. At exactly 10 o'clock that night, under the relentless cold rain, 20 men from the Falcone family surrounded the entire compound from 4 directions. Luciano sat in his own black Escalade, 200 meters from the warehouse, checking his Glock 19 one final time. He wore black Kevlar body armor beneath his leather jacket, fingerless leather gloves, and the Falcone Falcon ring he had never once removed was now turned inward against his palm, so it wouldn't catch the light. Vincenzo sat beside him, an earpiece in his ear, signaling that the teams were in position. Luciano had said nothing for the past 3 hours except tactical commands. He hadn't eaten anything since noon. He hadn't drunk a single drop of water. Every ounce of energy in his body had condensed into one thing, and that was the fury waiting to be released. 10 o'clock. Vincenzo nodded. Luciano stepped out of the car, and his team moved like a machine. 2 smoke grenades were thrown into the east and west entrances at the same time. Gunfire erupted in less than 3 seconds. Team 1 struck from the north into the office section. Team 2 breached from the roof by rope, and Luciano's own team attacked straight through the main door. He shot the first man down before he could even raise his gun. The second fell with a bullet through his forehead. 8 minutes. The gunfight lasted exactly 8 minutes, and Luciano did not count them. He only moved forward, one room after another, one hallway after another, stepping over the bodies his men had dropped. He found Kovac in the central room, where the Bratva Pakan stood behind a desk, holding a compact AK rifle. Kovac laughed when he saw Luciano, the kind of laugh from a man who knew he had lost but didn't want to lose in silence. He shouted something in Russian that Luciano did not care to translate. Luciano fired only once. The bullet passed between Kovac's eyes, and his body fell backward, slamming into the bookshelf behind him. Luciano did not stop. He stepped over the body, pushed open the iron door behind the room, and entered a long hallway leading deeper into the warehouse. That was when he heard it. A faint moan, small as a kitten's cry, coming from behind a metal door at the end of the hall. His heart stopped for one beat. He ran. He kicked the door, and it burst open with a crash of metal. The room inside was an old, cold storage room for meat, the temperature only around 5 degrees, rusted iron hooks hanging from the ceiling, and in the middle of the concrete floor was a wooden chair, where Isabella sat with both hands tied behind her back and a loop of rope around her ankles. She was not gagged. Her gray wool coat was soaked with cold sweat. Her chestnut brown hair clung damply to her forehead, and her hands, though bound, were curled instinctively toward her belly, rounded now after 7 months of pregnancy. She lifted her head when she heard the door, and when she saw Luciano, her amber brown eyes filled with tears, but she was not crying from fear. She let out another painful moan, her legs drawing in slightly, and said in a trembling voice, "Luciano, it hurts. The baby hurts. It's too early. Only 28 weeks." Luciano dropped to his knees before her faster than he had ever done anything in his life. He pulled the knife from inside his jacket and cut the ropes around her hands and feet in 3 seconds. He lifted her into his arms, held her tight against his chest, and ran out of the cold room. Blood on his sleeves, the smell of gunpowder in his hair. But all he could think about was her broken breathing against his neck. He whispered into her hair, his voice shattering for the 2nd time in his life. "Don't leave me, Mia Vita. Don't leave me. I'm here. Our baby's here. We're all going to be all right." Vincenzo met him at the door, where a disguised medical vehicle was already waiting outside with an obstetrician who had been paid enough to forget everything she was about to see. Luciano placed Isabella inside the vehicle, held her hand, and only nodded to Vincenzo. The consigliere needed no further words. He would handle the scene under the law of omerta. No bodies would be found. No cameras would have any data left. No police would come. And by dawn, the old warehouse in Newark would be nothing but a cold pile of ash beneath the New Jersey rain. The Falcone family's medical team stabilized Isabella's early contractions during the drive back to Manhattan, giving her a dose of uterine relaxant medication and IV fluids to raise her blood pressure. By the time they reached the VIP wing of Mount Sinai Hospital, Dr. Elena Whitmore was already waiting at the private entrance with a team of 5 and a delivery room prepared. Isabella was taken straight in for monitoring. The contractions eased during the first 4 hours, but the baby had decided it was time to be born, and there wasn't a medicine in the world that could change that. The 28th week of the pregnancy, 12 weeks earlier than the due date, Dr. Whitmore stood before Luciano and spoke plainly. The baby would be underweight. Her lungs might not be fully developed, but at 28 weeks, the chance of healthy survival was still very high, with proper care. Isabella nodded when she heard the news. She held Luciano's hand and said their child had already survived too many impossible things for anyone to believe, so surviving one more wouldn't be so hard. 18 hours of labor began from there. Luciano did not leave the delivery room for even 1 second. He didn't go to the bathroom, didn't drink water, didn't answer his phone. He only sat in the chair beside the bed, holding Isabella's hand, wiping the sweat from her forehead after every contraction, and breathing with her in the rhythm the nurse instructed. When she cried out in pain during the 13th hour that she couldn't do it anymore, he bent close to her ear and whispered that she was the strongest woman he had ever known, that she had survived 32 years of another woman's conspiracy, that she had survived a cold room in Newark, and that their daughter was waiting for her. At 6:47 on Sunday morning, the first cry rang out in the delivery room. A baby girl, 2 pounds 12 ounces. Her lungs fought powerfully for their first breath despite her tiny weight. Dr. Whitmore lifted the baby, cleaned her, wrapped her in a pale pink towel, and placed her on Isabella's chest. The baby had thick black hair like her father, and when she opened her eyes for the first time in her life, Isabella saw the ice-blue eyes glittering with silver flecks that she had loved for the past 4 years, now set in a tiny face that had been born only 8 seconds ago. Luciano bent down and gently placed one finger into his daughter's small palm. She grasped his finger with all her tiny strength, and Don Luciano Falcone, the man all of Manhattan feared, cried for the second time in his life. The tears were quiet, with no sobbing, only drops sliding silently down his cheeks and falling onto the pink blanket around his firstborn child. Isabella looked at him, then at the baby, and whispered the name they had agreed on the previous Saturday night. Aurelia Magdalena Falcone. Luciano nodded, his voice caught in his throat. Aurelia, Golden Light, Magdalena, named after your grandmother. 1 hour later, after Isabella had been moved to the recovery room and Aurelia was lying in the incubator beside her, Luciano called Magdalena to the hospital. She walked into the room with eyes still red from 20 hours of waiting. Luciano stood, went to her, took his mother's wrinkled hands in his, and led her to the incubator. Mother, this is your granddaughter. I named her Aurelia Magdalena. Magdalena reached through the opening of the incubator, her trembling finger lightly touching the baby's tiny hand, and for the first time in 32 years since the day she was driven out of the Falcone mansion, she was openly allowed to hold a child of her own blood. Her tears rolled down and fell onto the glass of the incubator. Isabella held her hand from the other side of the bed. No one said anything. No one needed to. Meanwhile, at the Falcone mansion, Vincenzo Bianchi had summoned an emergency meeting of the family council. The 12 highest-ranking capos were present at 8 in the morning. Vincenzo presented all the evidence Magdalena had left on Luciano's desk 2 weeks earlier, along with the recording from the meeting at Zolotoy Kliuch that a Bratva informant had provided after Kovac's death, the old plot to slander Magdalena, the alliance with the Bratva, the Red Hook explosion that killed 3 young capos, Isabella's kidnapping. Everything was laid out in absolute silence. When Vincenzo finished, the council voted. 12 hands rose in agreement. Under the law of Omerta, Giovanna Falcone was not executed because she had been family blood for 3 generations, but she was sentenced to the harshest punishment short of death. All her personal assets were confiscated and redistributed among the loyal capos. Her name was erased from the official Falcone family tree. She was forced to leave American soil within 48 hours and move to a cloistered convent in Monreale, Sicily, where she would spend the final years of her life under the supervision of an old branch of the family, forbidden to contact anyone in New York, forbidden to leave the convent, and forbidden to own any personal property. Tommaso, her son, was demoted to the lowest position in the family and placed under house arrest for 1 year so his loyalty could be examined. And on the VIP floor of Mount Sinai Hospital, in the first sunlight of Sunday streaming through the window, a grandmother, a mother, and a granddaughter who had taken 32 years to finally meet sat together at last in a blessed silence. 2 years had passed since that fateful Sunday morning at Mount Sinai Hospital, and the Falcone mansion on the Upper East Side was no longer the place Isabella had once called a golden prison 4 years earlier. It had become a real home. The foyer walls were hung with family photographs instead of solemn old oil paintings. The wooden floors echoed with the toddling footsteps of a 2-year-old girl, and the smell of butter cookies Magdalena baked every Sunday afternoon had replaced the scent of Cuban tobacco that once drifted through the hallways. Aurelia Magdalena Falcone had just passed her 2nd birthday. A little girl with softly curled chestnut brown hair like her mother, and ice blue eyes glittering with silver flecks like her father, eyes that made her grandmother cry quietly every time she watched the child sleep. She ran through the mansion on tireless little legs, calling Magdalena Nana in the clumsy Italian voice the older woman had taught her from the moment she began to speak. Luciano had kept the promise he made to Isabella on the night Aurelia was born. Over 2 years, with the help of Vincenzo and a team of top Manhattan lawyers, he officially transformed the entire operation of the Falcone family into legitimate business. Falcone Holdings, the real estate company, now owned 17 office towers across Midtown and the financial district. 3 luxury boutique hotels had opened in the Hamptons under the Casa Falcone brand, each with its own music room and a Steinway piano Isabella had personally advised them to choose. The Italian restaurant chain, Luz della Nonna, with 8 locations across Manhattan and Brooklyn, had received its first Michelin star the previous spring, and the most famous chicken soup recipe on the menu was the very recipe Magdalena had taught Luciano on that snowy 2 o'clock morning nearly 3 years earlier. The loyal capos had been allowed to choose between following him into legitimate business or accepting a large payment to retire in peace, and most of them chose to follow him. On the Saturday afternoon of the 2nd week of December, in the rose garden behind the mansion, now covered with a thin layer of snow glittering like white sugar, Luciano and Isabella stood together once more beneath an arch of white roses and fresh pine branches to renew their marriage vows. It wasn't a political wedding held 3 weeks after a contract had been signed, as it had been 6.5 years earlier. It was a real ceremony, with the people they loved most, and with promises that came from the heart instead of from a debt. 30 guests were present: Isabella's parents, her younger brother, who had now graduated from Columbia University thanks to the debt forgiveness from years ago, Vincenzo and his wife, a few of Isabella's old friends from Juilliard, and Magdalena, wearing the pale blue wool dress Isabella had chosen for her with her own hands, sitting in the front row with Aurelia in her lap. She was not the officiant in the religious sense, but when Luciano and Isabella exchanged their new vows, they turned to her first, and she placed her wrinkled hands on their heads, blessing them in whispered Italian words she had not dared to speak aloud for 32 years. On Christmas Eve, 3 weeks later, when the entire mansion had fallen into quiet and Aurelia was sleeping soundly in her own room under Magdalena's watch, Isabella sat beside the large fireplace in the living room with Luciano. It was the same fireplace where, 2 years and 8 months earlier, the divorce papers had burned into ash. She rested her head on his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her waist, and inside her heart was a secret she had kept for 3 days, waiting for this exact night. She took his hand, placed it on her stomach, where a very slight curve had begun that only she knew about, and said it. A baby boy. 7 weeks. Completely natural. Luciano sat still for 3 seconds. Then he bent down, pressed his forehead to hers, and couldn't say a word. Tears rolled down his cheeks for the 3rd time in his life. Isabella smiled through her own tears and wiped his away with her thumb. After a long while, when the crackle of the fire was the only sound in the room, Luciano whispered into her hair, "You saved me, Bella. You saved a man I thought had died when he was 4 years old." She lifted her head and looked at him, her warm amber-brown eyes glowing in the firelight. "We saved each other, Luciano. That's what family does." And in that room, beneath the light of the fireplace, with one child asleep upstairs and another child growing inside her, Isabella Hartwell Falcone understood that their story had not ended on the night she almost signed the divorce papers. It had only truly begun. And this time, they were writing it together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one loving act at a time. This time, they were building something that would last forever. The story of Isabella and Luciano reminds us that true love is not something that never breaks, but something 2 people are willing to heal together after it does. It reminds us that outside pressure, whether it comes from family, society, or the expectations we place upon ourselves, does not have the right to determine a person's worth or the value of a marriage. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest miracles arrive at the very moment we believe we have lost everything. And it reminds us that silence can sometimes be the cruelest weapon in a relationship, while the truth, no matter how painful, is always the only path to freedom. Dear viewers, the story of Isabella and Luciano closes here, but perhaps something deeply personal still echoes inside each of us. How do you feel about their journey? Have there been moments in your own life when everything seemed to be over, only for something unexpected to open an entirely new chapter? Have you ever witnessed the miraculous power of forgiveness, patience, or a love that knows how to wait for the right moment to bloom? Please leave a comment below this video to share your feelings, because every story you tell is a precious gift, and we treasure every line we read. If today's story touched your heart, please press the like button, share this video with the people you love, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss meaningful stories every day. Our channel is always working with devotion to bring you emotional, profound, and deeply humane stories, and your companionship is the greatest motivation for us to continue this journey. We wish every viewer watching this video abundant health, a joyful life every day, and a peaceful heart amid all the storms of life. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.